Hi, I want to let you know that we're going to be discussing the topic of non-suicidal self-injury today. And so I want to let you know, just as a little trigger warning, that we may be covering some intense things. So you may want to pause this video and maybe bring someone with you to watch it, or maybe set it down for a time when you know that you feel particularly strong in which to watch it. Hi, welcome to this episode of Counsel Trends. I am Dr. Shauna Anderson, and I am with my partner, Dr. Mercy Connors. And we have an article today that is called The Impact of Social Media on Triggering Non-Suicidal Self-Injury in Adolescents, a Comparative Ambulatory Assessment Study. And it's from a relatively new journal that is called Borderline Personality Disorder and Emotion Regulation. And it came out in 2025, so it's actually a new article. And Mercy knows I have some feelings about this paper. I think it addresses an important issue,
Yes.
and some of the methodology is really great. And I'm really looking forward to discussing it with you guys today.
Yes.
So really what this study is looking at is urges around non-suicidal self-injury and other things around that. So I want to open up just real quickly with the definition that they use for non-suicidal self-injury is the deliberate and repetitive infliction of bodily harm without an observable intention to die. And so some examples include cutting, scratching, burning yourself, things like that, that we know teenagers engage in a lot.
Yep.
Generally, they say, according to the research, about 16 to 23% of adolescents will engage in this behavior, and it kind of peaks during kind of mid to late adolescence, like 15 to 17.
Yep.
One of the things they also talked about that I thought was interesting is they recognize that there are both intrapersonal and interpersonal risk factors that can actually trigger these. Do you want to talk about
Yeah, so
that?
when we talk about interpersonal, that's between us and another person. Intra is within yourself.
Yeah.
So that's what's very interesting. So it talks about, one of the things I thought was really interesting is they talked about perceived stress. So this isn't like actual stress,
Right.
it's how you view the stress,
Right.
which I think is really, really interesting.
Especially for teenagers.
Yes, because everything is stressful.
Exactly.
Right?
So true.
But, I think also that it is negative affect, which when we talk about affect, that's those negative emotions. So think sadness, anger, frustration, those types of things. And then that tends to be the ones that will engage in, so those that perceive the high stress and have those negative affect, so that's that intrapersonal.
Yeah.
But then alongside of that is that you have interpersonal issues. So say, for example, me and Shauna get into an argument about something. Now, if we had a good emotion regulation and stuff like that, we could handle that argument. But if we already are geared towards those negative emotions, perceiving that as a high stress, those types of things, then that's when it can increase.
Yeah.
So
really the study was looking at the risk factors of what might trigger the non-suicidal self-injury, whether it's interpersonal factors, intrapersonal factors, but also real life experiences and experiences on social media.
Right.
So were there negative real life events that happen or negative events on social media that were going to trigger? And it really looked at two different types of populations. So they gathered for their study, they had 25 subjects aged 14 to 18 that have a history of non-suicidal self-injury, either currently or in the past. And most of them were taken from a local psychiatric hospital in Vienna. And the other 25 that they looked at were controls to determine if there was a difference between them. So there were 25 that have a history of it. 25 were gathered just from the general population. And then what they had them do is they gave them an app to fill out 4 times a day for 7 days. And they were going to assess through those 4 different times, what was your level of perceived stress? Let's see, on a scale, I believe it was from 0 to 100. What was it? Negative emotion, of how much negative emotion do you have? How strong is your urge to engage in this form of non-suicidal self-injury? And also, did you actually engage in the non-suicidal self-injury?
Yeah, and I think that's really good because it gave you this very broad understanding. One of my favorite things that they did was that they did this 4 times a day.
Right.
Which I felt like was very wise to see, is there a time of day that this tends to be, which we found out in the study that there was, but we'll get to that.
Which is actually congruent with a lot of the research. And I know I have a lot of patients who self-harm that do it late in the evening, which is very interesting. So they had 3 different hypotheses that they were investigating. The first one is looking at the levels of perceived stress, that kind of negative emotion, and the urges, and they wanted to compare that just kind of throughout the day. Were there differences? Then they also were looking at, did they compare differently from the control population who doesn't engage in this? And then also, was there a difference between interpersonal and intrapersonal urges and the social media and real life events? So,
and it was very interesting because when they were first bringing these people into the group, they were looking at, for that non-suicidal self-injury group, like how many times did they engage in that? And I was like, whoa, okay, so 1.16 times in the past week. So that
was the average.
Was the average. So out of those 25 people in the last week, they at least did it once. And then over the past month, it was 5.28. So usually between 5 to 6 times over the last month. And then over the past year was over 69 times on average.
On average.
And that to me was very interesting. So this is like, when I look at that, I'm like, this is a coping mechanism. This is what they go to when they have that perceived stress or interpersonal issues. It's their go-to.
And that's interesting you bring it up that way, because when I work with people who engage in this non-suicidal self-injury, I do see it as a primary coping skill, and sometimes it can almost become like an addiction to where they can't stop. And they increase over time, more and more times doing it, just like you would with like drugs or alcohol, any other kind of addiction.
And I found that very interesting, so I wanted to highlight that because this is what we're talking about, is that it's not just that they've done it once in the past. This is like a consistent thing that they do.
So looking at the populations, again, we've got 50 participants, 25 that engage in this form of self-harm and 25 that do not. Most of them were female, and the average age, I believe, was kind of about, I can't find it right now, but I think it was about 15 or 16. And one of the things that they did notice is that those that engage in non-suicidal self-injury reported higher perceived stress and more depressive symptoms. 64% had a pre-existing mood disorder. 48% had personality disorders, which is interesting because technically you're not supposed to diagnose them
I thought that was
until
really
they're 18.
Too. Yes.
And 60% were on medication. But it's really funny when you kind of look at the demographics that way. Forgive me, but it almost sounds like well, duh. These are people that are in a psychiatric hospital.
Yes. These are people that really are struggling just in life in general. And so this just happens to be one of the things that they do to kind of relieve that stress.
Exactly. Okay, so let's see. Some of what they found, there's so many different things. I think one of the biggest issues that I actually want to tackle is that all of the actual incidents of self-harm were triggered by real life events. Isn't that interesting? They weren't self-injuring because of things that occurred on social media. It was actually based in real life.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense because that is real. It's not I'm watching something and that could be fake or could be real. This was something that they were literally engaged in. They personally were engaged in. And I feel like that makes a lot of sense.
But it is interesting because what else they found was that there were a very high number of individuals that actually had triggers. They had more triggers from online social media events. And that's where that was a little bit confusing to me of why do you think they had more urges to self-injure from negative social media interactions?
You know, I think that sometimes that's I feel like kids' imaginations are still very vivid at that age. You know, I almost wonder if it has to do with that and they're imagining all these things happening that really aren't happening, but in their mind it's happening. You know what I'm saying? I also find it interesting that it was between 4 and 8 p.m., which also I go back to, are these kids doing schoolwork? Is their mind engaged somewhere else, and then therefore their mind is now not engaged, and so therefore
when they actually engaged in the non-suicidal self-injury.
Yes, I wonder if there's something to that as well. Or is there maybe, I'm just pulling something out of the hat right now, like that sundowning effect. You know how we talk about with Alzheimer's that it's that the brain starts to slow down and it's harder for them to process. It's harder for us to engage in those positive coping skills because we're just tired.
Yes, and that you're carrying so much stuff. But I do think it is interesting, and it was funny, I shared with you, I was talking about this with my son last night, of what is going on with them that they're having more urges because of negative interactions on social media, but they're not acting on it. They're only acting on the things in real life. And my son is so funny. He's like, well, did they ask them? I'm like, what a brilliant question. Did they ask them why that is? And unfortunately, they didn't.
No. Yeah.
But I thought that was a really great question because what they identified is that during the 7 days, that there was no difference between the control group and those that were engaging in non-suicidal self-injury in terms of watching social media. So they were on social media basically about the same amount of time, but people who were engaging in the non-suicidal self-injury had more urges to harm themselves and more negative affect.
Well, do you think it goes back to that whole addiction thought process that you just were mentioning, that this is my urge, and so therefore I need a reason to do it, so therefore...
But why don't they act on it?
I don't know.
That's why I'm saying I think it's interesting they only act on it when it's in real time. And so we were hypothesizing about this last night, that maybe if someone's bullying you on social media, yes, you're going to have urges to cut. But if you're on your phone, it's very easy to get off off of TikTok and just go to Instagram.
Right.
And that you can very quickly shift your mind. And so maybe the urge may pass versus if, let's say, you're a teenager and you get in a fight with your parents in real time, you're going to obviously have the urge because you act on it, but it may be more difficult to distract yourself.
Maybe.
And that's why more people are acting on it based on real-time issues.
Yeah.
Because I do know I've had a lot of patients that will talk about that they'll watch things on social media, such as images of people cutting and things like that. That's very disturbing, and that will make them want to self-harm. But this data is showing that they actually may not go through with it.
So I'm wondering, too, is it what you were just talking about is like that ability to turn it off?
Maybe.
Like, I have a choice in this matter, and I'm, not going to watch that film that's talking about cutting. Turn it off.
Right. Or if someone bullies me, I can go on to a different app and find a friend.
Right. But if you're having a fight with your parents, that's in the house, it's happening real time, that tension within the home, may be so depressing or so,
Or even that tension that you have with, like, let's say a friend, if you're a teenager and you have an actual negative event, that there may not be as many distractions for you to actually act on the urges.
Yeah, or if it's, like we have, text messages, right? The interaction keeps happening.
True.
Even though they want to end maybe try to end the conversation, but the interaction keeps coming at them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I found that to be one of the most interesting issues with the study was that the social media really just produces the urges and the real life stuff produces the actual actions.
I said one of the things that I think is really, really interesting here is that once somebody does engage, so they've had an urge, they engage in it, they don't feel any better.
Right.
And I found that, in all of our psychoeducation and understanding, I'm like, that's supposed to relieve it. But what it's saying here is that they had the same amount of perceived stress, the same amount of negative affect. There's no difference.
Right.
And I'm like, so then why? Why engage in that if you're not getting anything from it?
Right. I wish they would have asked them that question too.
I know, right?
But it is interesting because I know, again, having worked with a lot of people that do engage in this behavior, is that over time they realize it doesn't make them feel better, that they actually now have guilt and shame over engaging in it, and that sometimes the negative affect may shift, but that it no longer gives them that rush. And that's why I often think of it as like an addiction, that initially you get that first rush, but the more and more you do it, you develop a tolerance. There is the negative affect afterwards because there is that guilt and shame, that it just doesn't work, but that they don't have any other strategies in which.
This is the only thing that they know to do, so they engage in it. I also found it interesting, and I just thought of this while you were talking, that mostly it's girls. And so I'm wondering, too, if girls are like, well, I don't want another scar, or I don't want, anybody to see this. Could that be it as well, that they don't maybe, I'm just giving a suggestion, they don't go as deep or something like that, that could possibly,
Although I will tell you, I've had some patients that have been very proud of their scars.
Oh, interesting.
That they say that their scars are almost evidence of their internal pain, and that they want to show others how much they hurt by their scars.
Interesting.
And even more interesting is I once worked with a patient years ago as a rookie clinician. I wasn't even licensed yet, and worked with a young teenager who had just had scars everywhere. And when we brought her mother in to discuss her self-injury, the mom's response to looking at her daughter's scars was, "Don't worry, honey, we can get plastic surgery to fix them." Which I think is so missing the boat.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where we're recognizing here is that individuals that do engage in non-suicidal self-injury have more negative affect. They have more negative interactions online and in real life.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they don't know how to manage it, and they may not have the people in their lives to help them make sense of it and respond in a better way.
Yeah, and it's that modeling aspect too, how the parent responded to that. If the parent would have responded in a way of understanding and let's work through this together, and we are a partner in this, as compared to, oh, we'll just cover it up. Then you're kind of like, oh, well, I know where I know where this is coming from.
Exactly. Well, and that's where one of the reasons why I wanted to bring up a non-suicidal self-injury paper to talk about and counsel trends is just, it is something that does go on in so many teenagers, and the importance of recognizing what causes it is the negative emotions throughout the day, that it may get worse at night, that a lot of these teenagers just don't have necessarily the strategies to manage it. And I'm just going to share real briefly what I do a lot of times with my patients using a little bit of some dialectical behavior therapy is having them make a list. You've heard me talk about this a lot, of like 100 things that they can do instead of engage in their self-harm, and then put them all in what I call a coping bowl. And when they get distressed, having that bowl nearby at all times so that they can pull in. And if they don't want to do the first one, there's 99 find more to do.
Right.
And there's a lot more options, which is kind of like what we found in terms of the social media, that they have the urges, but they're not acting on it. And kind of our hypothesis is that there's a lot more things on social media that they could look at to distract themselves.
Yeah. And I think that's really wise, because I do think that we have to realize that there are lots of coping skills out there, and we can engage in lots of different things. It doesn't have to be the 1, 2, or 3 that we tend to go for, but we could be creative, and we can really come up with some new ones. And that kids are resilient. Like they do like thinking through these things. It's a good exercise for their brain. It's a good thought process of hope and how they can really actually help themselves. So really what you're talking about is giving somebody a bowl of hope.
Right. Oh, I love that.
Instead of like, oh, you have to do this one thing. It's always this pathway.
Well, and that's where I guess we want to say, if any of you are struggling with non-suicidal self-injury, we highly recommend that you go and meet with a clinician, a therapist, tell a supportive person in your life. And we really recommend that you find alternative coping strategies and that you don't address this alone. We know that the answer to pain is relationship. And so if you can find a professional or someone really close to share what's going on with you emotional, and finding other ways in which to find hope to regulate the intense struggles that you may be experiencing.
Well, we thank you so much for being with us today. If you liked what you've heard, please subscribe, hit that like button for us, and give us a comment. If you have a question about what we're talking about, or you want us to do a specific topic, let us know. We really want to hear that from you, and we love being a part of your life.